what really happened with your host, Mike Rivero, because World War III is a really bad idea. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Thursday, December 6th, 2018. Sure happy it's Thursday. Sure happy it's Thursday. Sure happy it's Thursday. We have got a lot to talk about today. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Mike is in our control room, ready to answer the phone, put you on the air with your comments, questions, and opinions. So let's just get right on into it. First of all, the corporate media still going on about George Herbert Walker Bush. We're getting sky camera coverage of this train trip, and I know that's kind of been a traditional thing where, you know, the president, his remains are sent by train and people can stand by the side of the track and wave flags and watch the box go by, but it is getting a little bit much, I think, and other people are beginning to say the same thing. Over at Patriot Rising, they're saying this lionizing him in the media for days and having the pilgrims file past his coffin. These are not Republican traditions. And the founding fathers of this nation probably would have been pretty much appalled by this gratuitous celebration bordering on worship of any of them. So it really is time enough. And before we get into the rest of the news, I want to share kind of a personal event, if you will. A little while ago, we ran this story on how suicide here in the United States is at a 50-year high. In fact, there's so much suicide, it's actually negatively impacting U.S. life expectancy. Between that and drug overdoses, life expectancy in the U.S. Is down. So the reason I brought that up is this morning at about 3 o'clock, there was this horrendous crash right out in front of where Claire and I live. So, you know, I got dressed, got a flashlight, went on out to see what was going on, along with a bunch of our neighbors. And there was this truck that had slammed into a tree. And when the crash had happened, I literally felt our building shake. That's how big the impact was. The truck was completely totaled. And the driver had run off. And I don't claim to be a detective or an accident investigator, but the things I noticed almost immediately was the fact that the truck had been traveling fast enough to total it, not to mention shake the entire complex when it hit that tree. It had hit the tree dead spot on, right in front of the driver's seat. And looking behind the truck, there were no brake marks. And I think this was not an accident. I think this was an attempted suicide, which failed because of the airbags. Or maybe the person later passed on from internal injuries, because that was a heck of a wallop. And there were a lot of personal belongings in the truck, which makes it look like this might have been a homeless person living out of their truck. They were wearing fuzzy slippers, bedroom slippers. And I know that because they lost one when they were running away. And so it looked to me like it was an attempted suicide. And it's one thing to read about American suicides in an article online, on a blog or something. And it's a different experience to walk on out and see it right in front of your eyes. And it makes you really kind of wonder what our society has become, where there is so much pressure on American citizens that they are resorting to suicide in more higher and higher numbers all the time. So I didn't get a lot of sleep after that, and but yeah, it's kind of a disturbing thing to see. Probably would have been worse if the body had been there. But as I said, they'd run off, and I didn't stick around to find out what happened after that here. All right, so let's start talking about the conflict zones, because there's a lot going on, and yes, we'll get into the economy as well. It was a very tumultuous day on the stock markets here. Article coming on out from Middle East Eye, basically laying out that the reason the United States refuses to yield to the inevitable and leave Syria is that the U.S. is still planning for perpetual war in the Middle East, and they see Syria as their launching pad. It's got a good strategic location. It borders the Mediterranean. It borders many of these other nations. It would be a good platform for engaging in more war against more Middle Eastern nations, and that's why the United States is trying to figure out some way they can stay in there. Meanwhile, government forces in Syria have eliminated over 23,000 militants since the start of this year, and they've liberated 387 settlements. That's a lot of really good work. 40,000 members of the moderate opposition have surrendered and joined the government forces, and these fighters reportedly surrendered 650 units of weapons and military equipment to the Syrian Arab Army. This is all really good news. Now, the chief of the general staff also praised the role of the Russian Center for Reconciliation of the Warring Party, which is carrying out humanitarian operations around the country. According to General Gerasimov, over 230,000 people were evacuated via humanitarian corridors during these operations. He also said the situation in the U.S.-controlled zone in northeastern Syria, saying the situation there is getting worse. It's deteriorating. All right, we're going to do a shout out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. And apparently the Syrian Arab Army has evacuated hundreds of civilians, mostly women and children, from the ISIS-held pocket in the middle Euphrates River Valley. And this was in coordination with Russian forces. They've been giving food, medical care, and they're being transported back to their villages and towns. So it's good news. And again, whatever the United States overtly wanted to accomplish in Syria, they failed. Just like in Iraq. When they went into Iraq, we were told it was about weapons of mass destruction, which turned out not to exist. It was about Iraq's support for 9/11, which even George W. Bush admits there wasn't any. And, of course, to just fight terrorist extremists, Muslim extremists, forgetting, of course, that Iraq was a secular nation under Saddam Hussein. So the overt reasons for the war all failed. We know that there are covert reasons that are really what's driving it. But overtly, the Iraq war was a failure for the U.S. Government here. And we're seeing the same thing repeated here in Syria. Now, as you know, the propaganda machine is just on rock and roll, warp drive, full tilt boogie about Russia's coming, Russia's coming, Russia's going to invade this, Russia's going to invade that. They're naming every country they can think of: Norway, Ukraine, Baltic, Poland, countries even further west. And of course, the media is out there saying that NATO and the United States are there to prevent that. See how important it is for NATO and the U.S. to be on your territory to protect you from those evil Russians here. But you know what I've been saying about look for what should be there and isn't. And the same thing applies here to Russia. Okay? Why would they want to invade the Ukraine, the Baltic states, or anywhere else? Now, the entire propaganda campaign against Russia rests on that claim that Russia annexed Crimea and sent military forces into the Donbass. Now, everybody's been paying attention now realizes both of those claims were total nonsense. The party who broke the post-Cold War international order and borders were the NATO member states when they used military force to break up Yugoslavia. And of course, we know as far as Crimea is concerned, they voted about their future in a referendum. They voted to secede from Ukraine, and then they voted to join the Russian republics. Contrast that with the situation of Kosovo, where they had absolutely no choice at all with what happened to them. As for the August 8th, 2008 war, it's now realized basically it was Saakashvili who started that, not Russia. Now, the West is still trying to make a big deal about the incident in the Kerch Strait, and now the European Union is trying to step on in and involve themselves as well by demanding that there has to be European Union mediation to solve these incidents here. Harumph, harumph, harumph. So everybody's tried to take advantage of the situation. But again, the official story is not reality, and yet policy is being forced on that, or based on that official story. Trump, at the last minute, canceled his meeting with President Putin at the G20, supposedly because of this Russia-Ukraine dispute. And according to Trump, the meeting had to be canceled because the Russians seized 3 Ukrainian naval vessels in Russian waters that refused to follow instructions from the Russian military. That is an accurate assessment of what happened. Pat Buchanan wrote in a recent column, how is this little kerfuffle, thousands of miles away, any of our business? It really isn't. It's just another excuse to demonize Russia and propagandize Russia. Now, up in London, the Russian embassy has issued a memo, if you will, pointing out the fact that the British government continues to ignore the fact that these Ukrainian warships in the Kerch Strait were acting illegally. And it was a Ukrainian provocation. Kiev illegally crossed the borders of Russian territorial waters. And it was a blatant and deliberate violation. They conducted dangerous maneuvers in the strait. They refused to respond to radio communications. They refused to respond when Russian patrol boats came on out and ordered them to stop. This was all Ukraine here. But everybody's going to get on board, and they're just going to pound on it as hard as they can. And here we start to see yet another real agenda behind the story. Apparently, according to a senior State Department official, the Kerch incident should remind the European Union why the Nord Stream 2 oil pipeline is a bad idea. Because the less infrastructure you have, the less gas infrastructure you have bypassing Ukraine, the weaker the deterrent. In other words, the Nord Stream 2 would allow Russia to basically evade oil sanctions. The U.S. wants Russia dependent on oil pipelines under the control of the West. And Russia doesn't want to do that anymore. Now, interestingly enough, speaking of the Donbass, apparently a detachment of soldiers wearing NATO uniforms were seen by the People's Militia of the self-proclaimed People's Republic of Lugansk in Donbass territory currently controlled by Kiev. And they basically said there were 28 men equipped with NATO uniforms. So NATO is already in Ukraine. They're out there screaming, Russia's in Ukraine, Russia's in Ukraine. No, NATO is in Ukraine. Meanwhile, trending to amp up the tensions even more, the U.S. military has carried out what is called an open skies flight over Ukraine. And it was done to reaffirm the U.S. commitment to Ukraine. And basically, there's an open skies treaty that says one country can fly over the other. There's no restriction. And apparently the aircraft used was a surveillance aircraft. But it's basically sending a message. We stand with Ukraine. And in a statement, the Pentagon basically said it was because of Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukrainian naval vessels in the Black Sea. If at first you don't succeed, lie, lie again. Now, over in the parliament of Ukraine, the Verkhovna Rada, they have now upheld President Poroshenko's decision to terminate the Treaty on Friendship, Cooperation, and Partnership with Russia. And apparently it passed overwhelmingly. And the treaty will be terminated officially on April 1st, 2019. It's a largely symbolic gesture at this point, obviously. Okay, turning on now down to Israel. Israel started to talk about Operation Northern Shield. It's a military and also apparently an engineering operation aimed at destroying what it alleges are offensive tunnels belonging to the Lebanese resistance group Hezbollah on the border with Lebanon. And the operation represents Israel's approach to war, which they call the war between wars, fighting smaller battles with limited goals, avoiding all direct confrontation, almost like guerrilla war. So, now here's where it gets interesting. Former Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Yaalon admitted on Thursday that Israeli officials have for years lied about the existence of these alleged Hezbollah tunnels beneath the Lebanon-Israel border. And in an interview on Israel's Army radio, Yaalon said the Israeli officials lied about the tunnels before they decided to carry out an operation to destroy them early this week. And Yaalon said, "We did it to mislead the other side. There is an exaggeration in the way it was presented, and I hope it does not hurt us." But he came on out and said back in 2016, there was no single tunnel in the north. Anyway, he believes that there's an exaggeration in the ongoing operation. All right, over at the United Nations, the United States is trying to pressure the Arab states to support its anti-Hamas resolution. And basically, they're trying to get them to vote in favor of this draft resolution that has been introduced at the United Nations that condemns the Palestinian resistance. Apparently the U.S. Special Representative for International Negotiations, Jason Greenblatt, sent letters to diplomats from 9 Arab countries asking them to support this move. And the 9 countries were Morocco, Oman, Bahrain, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Qatar. And in the letter he said the Palestinian Authority's opposition to the U.S. proposal is hypocrisy, as it considers Hamas an enemy and imposes sanctions on it in Gaza. Now, the Palestinian Authority and Fatah have criticized the U.S. draft resolution, considering it absolute American support for the continuance of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Meanwhile, over in the West Bank, the Palestinian Energy and Natural Resources Authority is rejecting Israeli threats against renewable energy projects that are being built by the Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. And apparently the last Israeli threat was made against private renewable energy projects connected to the local Palestinian grid. Now, the authority says it's complying with Israel's rules. It gives licenses to these projects in areas A and B of the occupied West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority has full administrative sovereignty. But basically, the Israeli occupation has been continuously seeking to undermine all projects which might help the Palestinian economy become independent. Israel wants Palestine dependent on Israel's provided electricity, or oil or gas, because dependency is slavery. So, Benjamin Netanyahu's legal problems keep mounting up. Apparently, Israeli TV is saying that Netanyahu asked Bezek owner Shaul Elovitch to basically run a negative article on a political rival's wife. And basically, it was an article on the employment of Naftali Bennett's spouse at a non-kosher restaurant, which would be seen as a very, very serious scandal in Israel here. As we mentioned yesterday, 2 U.S. Marine aircraft crashed off the Japanese coast yesterday. One was an F-18, the other was a refueling aircraft. 7 crew went down. 2 have been found so far. 1 is in stable condition. The condition of the other is not known. We're going to take a break here for some commercials, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. We're going to go to the phones now to Jim in New York. Aloha, Jim. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, hi, Mike. I'm just was watching the Bush funeral, and, you know, Americans, we have short memories. everything is Obama and Clinton. They forget what a monster George Bush, particularly George Bush Jr., W. If they could remember the war crimes, I mean, Fallujah, war crime, Abu Ghraib, sodomizing children in front of their parents. And I find a lot of the, quote, alt-right sites, people talk about Trump derangement syndrome.
Yes.
A lot of them have Obama and Hillary derangement syndrome, and yet they gloss over what a monster W. Bush particularly was. Of course, he was just a puppet too, but was under, if the buck stops with the president. Bush administration is the greatest murderers of the 21st century, if you go by death count. And I think a lot of the, quote, alt-right should remind themselves, forget about latest puppet, Obama, Hillary. You said it many times, it's a systemic problem. And oh my God, when I think back, and I forget too, what a monster the Bush administration was.
Yes.
And how people forget it. Oh my God.
Well, again, you look back at all that history, the Bay of Pigs, the possible link to the JFK assassination, Iran-Contra. There's a lot of darkness there. And to be very honest, I think the elder Bush was definitely much, much worse than Bush Jr.
Well, I think Bush Jr., I don't think he was running things, but it was under his administration.
I agree. I'm sure that Daddy was pulling the little ring behind George W. Bush's mouth to flap it.
And Cheney and Rumsfeld and greater minds, but it was under the Junior Bush, the greatest mass murderer of the 21st century so far.
Yes.
But that's all I wanted to say. And I'd like to remind people who hate Obama and Hillary, and I don't like them either, just remember W. Bush and what he did. And that's all I want to say. And thank you very much, Mike.
All right. Thanks an awful lot here. And we will let you go. The phone lines are open again. All right, let's talk about what's going on over in France, because the situation does not look like it's going to de-escalate. In fact, it's getting more intense. The French police union is now calling on the police to join the Yellow Vests protests. So this is no longer a case of the protesters over here and the French government over here. You now have different segments of the government joining up on different sides here. And there's going to be another major protest over this weekend. And LSC is actually concerned there could be an actual coup d'etat attempt or a revolution. And the protesters are out there basically. They're already expanding what they want. This is not going to stop with the end of that carbon tax. Now they're talking about they want an increase in the minimum wage. And at the risk of being arrested under French law, they're starting to talk about closing those open borders and getting rid of some of these migrants who have become such a problem, who've soiled their beautiful city. So it's getting very, very intense there. Anyway, France has now completely abandoned that fuel tax, which was essentially a carbon tax. At first they said they were going to delay it for 6 months. Now they've said it's gone. It's definitely gone. So Macron has failed on that one. And here is where it gets to be a problem, because this plan for a new world order rested on 3 pillars. One was human-caused global warming, and it just collapsed. So they were going to use Climate Gate to scare us all into accepting a global environmental authority and the carbon tax to exert more control over us. That just fell apart. The Paris Accord, for all intents and purposes, just got shredded. So Macron is now a victim of the climate change, global warming agenda. What? Oh, we got to take another break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And for our new listeners who have not been with us for a while, those holiday music bumps are the creation of my lovely wife, Claire Rivero. And they're from her album, Christmas Without Borders, which she put out a few years ago, and which is available on iTunes. Plug, 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 plug. All right, getting on back to France here. So we're seeing this intense anger boiling up in the French people with these the yellow vest protests. Where does yellow vest come from? Well, it turns out in France, all drivers are required to own one of those yellow reflective vests, which actually is a pretty good idea to have one of those if your car breaks down in the middle of the night. So everybody already had them, and they put it on as sort of their uniform for the protests here. And what the French people want is they want a lower cost of living, cheaper energy. They basically want to have a better standard of living. And they're mostly fed up with this global warming elitism, because more and more people around the world are realizing it was all a gigantic scam. And it's one thing when Al Gore is scamming the United States or something like that. But when your own government is playing that same game, oh, global warming, we got to take more money from you, it does reach a breaking point, and that is basically what's happened. And these are the most violent protests France has seen since the 1960s. And here's where it's getting interesting, because the French Parliament's left parties, at least 3 of the left-wing parties in the French Parliament, have agreed to discuss the possibility of a vote of no confidence against the government. And among those planning to question Macron's leadership is La France Insoumise Party, whose leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon has long been a vocal critic of the current government. So we could see a change of government there in France. Hopefully a peaceful transition. But right now, the Macron disapproval rate has hit an all-time record high of 76%. Now, of course, the globalists are desperate to keep Macron in power against the will of the people, because he's been pushing that globalist agenda. Climate change, open borders, free migration. People have hit a breaking point here. And I wish the French people well. Vive la liberté. Okay, there appears to have been what may be another piece of gratuitous propaganda. This came out of NPR, where they're claiming North Korea is expanding a missile base in a remote mountainous part of the country, according to commercial satellite imagery studied by independent researchers. And researchers say they see clear signs the base is being upgraded. Well, I'm not sure, at least based on the image that was attached to this article, because it's your classic, we're going to put one over you. It's a wide area image. This time, at least, it's in color. It's not particularly sharp. And there's all these little blobby shapes in there with circles and a little arrow and a label saying, this is a hardened bunker and this is the... They did the same thing to us in Iraq. Colin Powell, when he was at the United Nations, he held up this blurry photo of these white blobs against a dark background and said, this is a chemical weapons decontamination vehicle. And when they finally got to that area in Iraq, it turned out it was just ordinary, everyday firefighting equipment. Remember when they tried to tell us these balloon inflators were mobile biological weapons laboratories? Truth truly is the first casualty of war. Okay, apparently the United States has sailed a little too close to a Russian base bordering on the Sea of Japan, and the Russian military is now keeping what they say is a close watch on the U.S. destroyer, the McCampbell. Apparently, earlier today, or last night, across the other side of the date line, approached a Russian military base in the Primorye region. Now, currently the destroyer is 400 kilometers away from the Russian shore. So, again, it's another provocation. And to ordinary people, I say a big deal about it. But if you go back and you study Arthur H. McCollum's 8-step plan to provoke Japan into attacking us, and we'll be talking about that tomorrow because tomorrow's Pearl Harbor Day. One of the things the U.S. kept doing was sailing their warships right off the coast of Japan, which to Japanese sensibilities was a tremendous insult. The attitude back then was, you've got your side of the Pacific and we've got our side. What are you doing over here? All right, let's talk a little bit about some of our domestic politics here. There's an article that came out of the original antiwar.com saying it's time for Trump to completely declassify all the documents in this Russia Gate hoax because it has gone on way too long. It's gone on way too long. And it is clearly a witch hunt and an attempt to manufacture a crime that doesn't exist. In fact, this article quotes Stalin's Secret Service chief Lavrentiy Beria, who once boasted, "Show me the man, I'll show you the crime." So, another article, and I agree with this one, also from the original antiwar.com. Trump's timidity is letting Comey off the hook. And Trump has apparently basically not helped the House Republicans trying to get this situation with Comey resolved. Now, they went back and forth. There was a request for Comey to testify. He turned him down. Then there was a subpoena. He briefly went to court to try and get that quashed. I think lawyers told him that was not going to happen. So they went back and forth, and now finally Comey will testify behind closed doors. And then after that, there will be a transcript likely to be heavily redacted that will be released. This lets Comey pretend that he wanted a public testimony because he's got nothing to hide. So it's all politics here right now. And apparently that closed-door meeting will happen tomorrow, Pearl Harbor Day. We'll see what comes out of that. Tucker Carlson came out with yet another one of his wonderful broadcasts, pointing out that our ruling class has clamped down on freedom of speech as never before. And he's absolutely right. And they've got the assistance of the tech giants to do it. They're trying to criminalize criticism of Israel. They're trying to criminalize criticism of the immigration policies. They're basically lining up all these favored so-called protected status groups and give them all kinds of laws saying you can't say bad things about them. They're trying as hard as they can to chip away at the First Amendment in a way where Americans would say, well, okay, I could see in this one exception that we should limit freedom of speech. But there can't be a limit on freedom of speech. Because if there are limits, it's not freedom of speech, it's permitted speech. And permitted speech is something you find in every dictatorship in history. Okay, now, apparently new emails have been released by House Republicans, or actually released to House Republicans, and confirm, once again, in fact, maybe enough to basically say, yeah, this is no longer speculation. The FBI and the DOJ committed egregious abuses of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. This is from The Hill by John Solomon. and basically confirms the FBI knew the Christopher Steele dossier was total junk and still went ahead and used it in their application for the FISA warrant to spy on Trump campaign advisor Carter Page. So, anyway. Story that is coming out of Daily Crusader. Apparently, Courthouse News Service is reporting that federal prosecutors have announced charges against 4 men connected to the law firm Mossack Fonseca, which has extensive ties to the Clinton Foundation. Now, there's no indictment against the Clinton Foundation, but if you remember, this went all the way back to the Panama Papers, tax evasion, tax avoidance. Now, the charges include conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. And this comes nearly 3 years after the leak of the Panama Papers. So somebody may decide they're going to cut a plea bargain. And that would be a good thing. Okay, let's look at this real quick here. Yes, we're in good shape here. Over at Kamala Harris' office, one of her top aides, Larry Wallace, has had to resign because apparently he got sued for harassment, and he wound up paying $400,000 in settlements while working for the Democrat at the California Department of Justice in 2017. And apparently the lawsuit involved gender harassment and forcing her into demeaning behavior. All righty. Now, this is a very interesting article. This is out of Vanity Fair, which is kind of unusual, but they're reporting on this. Apparently, Donald Trump is seriously thinking he's going to run again in 2020. And according to this article, sources in the White House are saying that Trump is thinking of replacing Mike Pence in the second term, taking him off the ticket. Try and get somebody on there that will revive the Republican base after Trump has basically alienated so many of us. Now, that is a very tricky thing to do, because if you will remember, back when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, he was assassinated in his first term, he had made the decision he was going to get rid of LBJ in the second term. And LBJ found out from one of his staffers who was roommates with Mary Jo Kopechne, who, as you know, was a Kennedy party girl. Now, to what extent LBJ was involved in the assassination is unknown, but it certainly didn't help the situation. Now, the other day we had a phone call discussing about demographics and Americans who trust the media or do not trust the media, and whether it's the older people who are wise about what's going on or the younger. So I found this article here today. This came out of Patriot Rising. Apparently there has been a study done that shows half of all high school students do not trust the corporate media to report accurately and fairly. And apparently this was one of the first such study to be done. Normally it's the adults and people with disposable income are the focus of these studies. But it basically means the corporate media is failing. So did Common Core. All right, we're going to take a phone call. Dustin in New Jersey, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Maybe that's why Nikki Haley is going to not be in the UN. Maybe he's going to use her as his vice president pick, which would be horrendous, even worse than Pence. I mean, either that or maybe Bolton will be his vice president.
Personally, I think it's a bad idea, but you may be onto something. If Trump were to get a female vice president, that would pull the feminist vote away from the Democrats.
Well, you know what? We might be at war by then. I mean, because she just keeps pushing that right-wing, that nonsense crap.
Well,
you know?
that was her job.
Like you were saying before.
That was her job.
Yeah.
She was there speaking what she was told to say.
Hey, Mike, I wanted to. What's your take on the CFO of Huawei? She was basically kidnapped. You're right. I mean, this is all about economics. I mean.
Well, it is.
What did she supposedly do wrong?
Well, we're still trying to find out. Apparently, she's been accused of violating the Iran sanctions. She was up in Canada, but the Canadian authorities arrested her at the request of the United States. And a lot of people are trying to blame the stock market downturn on that arrest, but I think they're just scapegoating her. But it's rather revealing that our stock markets are so fragile that just news of this arrest supposedly is enough to set off a selling wave. Now, the stock market ended close to zero. And let me see what the final number there was. It was down. The Dow was down about 80, but at one point in the day, it was down 740 points, and that's got to be making people very, very nervous.
But that tells you something. If it was down that much, because the day after the stock market was closed, because which that's a conspiracy by itself, closing the stock market. But they have done that before, I believe, right? Close the stock market. Well, they close it for holidays, but I don't consider George Bush's, a holiday.
Well, Trump declared it to be a federal holiday. That's what happened. He signed an executive order. Wednesday is going to be a federal holiday, and that will be that. But
yeah, if you look, it's down. It's a big. Everybody knows it's a bubble. Like I said, when Trump ran, he said we're in a big fab. He just came out today. Did you see that tweet or whatever? He said, he goes, when I'm not going to be here, basically, it's going to implode. That's what he basically said today, right? The new statement he made.
Yep.
It's like, it's a bubble, and then when he's in, it's not a bubble, and then when he's out, it's a bubble again. I don't understand that.
I don't either. Anyway, Dustin, thank you for the phone call. We got to take a break for commercials, and we will be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. So we're talking about the economy, and the Dow opened this morning about 300 down. It dropped to 740 down at one point, at which point you could see there were these up shoves. If you look at the volatility and you look at the actual graph there, somebody somewhere was trying to shove it back up, and they didn't get it into the green. And the question is that thundering herd on the floor of the stock exchange going to believe the market has turned around again? Or do they just not care how much of other people's money get poured into the market to keep it looking good here? But I imagine right about now, a lot of people are looking at their 401ks and getting just a little bit nervous, because it could really start to unwind here. Anyway, like I said, we know that there are fundamental problems with the American economy and the stock market, but as is usually the case, when there is a downturn, they look for somebody to blame. And of course, one of the things that they're blaming this on is the China trade war. But it's not the real problem any more than the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the real cause of World War I. It's just a focal point here. But it does tell us just how fragile the market really is. Even Bloomberg is out there saying now this is the worst time in decades to make money in the markets. And when Bloomberg is out there saying that, you know that there's an issue. People are realizing all the fraud, all the duct tape, all the king's horses can't hold it together much longer. Apparently out in San Francisco, house and condo prices are starting to head downward rather rapidly, which means we're going to have another real estate bubble crash with more underwater mortgages, more foreclosures. The system is fundamentally flawed by being based on a currency created out of thin air and loaned into circulation at interest. Story out of CNBC. Payroll growth slowed in November. The labor markets are tightening, which is rather interesting when you realize this is the time of year when the shopping malls should be hiring up for the holiday shopping rush. But apparently the job gains were all concentrated from services providing companies. Anyway, people are still looking at Deutsche Bank and what's going on over there because Deutsche Bank is huge. It is global. What would happen if it failed? We'll talk about that when we come back from the station break. Oh, and we have a caller waiting on the line. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, and we're still seeing televised pictures of the hearse carrying the coffin of former President George H.W. Bush. It really has gone on for way, way too long. I'm going to go ahead and take this phone call before we get back to Deutsche Bank here. So, Robert in Northern California, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Mike. I hope you and Claire are well. You know, I think we just got a cameo appearance from the plunge protection team there. I think that's the explanation for this stock market thing. Meanwhile, if they keep carrying around Bush like they are, we're going to see 6 weeks and he's going to be like toted from town to town or something. Being sarcastic there, but, you know, yeah, 4 days of a funeral. I think that's enough even for the greatest anti-hero we ever had.
Well, I'm surprised they didn't stuff and mount him in the rotunda and leave him there permanently.
Hey, don't give him any ideas, man.
Okay.
Well, you know, it's just I'm looking at everything from a big perspective, sir, and I'm sure you see it too. There's so much going on. We've got these protesters in France. We've just arrested one of Chinese folks, one of the finest in their electronics industry. I'm sure that kind of poked the dragon in the butt, so to speak. I'm sorry to be crass, but meanwhile, we're like poking our nose in the bear's face over there. Just 20 ways to Sunday. We've got the economy on the fritz here, and I'm starting to wonder if I'm not the only one who feels like we're approaching the top of that first big hill on the roller coaster. You know what I mean?
You can almost feel it in your gut. You can just feel in your gut something has gone wrong. And I'm starting to think that a lot of the very bizarre behavior we're seeing in our society is from people who are also sensing something has gone wrong with the country, but they don't want to face up to it. They're looking for ways to avoid it. And so they just go off and get involved.
I agree.
A lot of other bizarre stuff here.
Well, and I think a lot of them have just been educated into not understanding where a solution might be. They've taken critical thinking out of our schools for long enough now that we're starting to see the bona fide result. This is how the new normal is going to be, I'm afraid. This is not good, but it is here.
Well, I think there's going to be a big collapse. I think the United States is going to collapse the way the Soviet Union did or the way ancient Rome did. There's so many parallels. And I really, while it would cause tremendous hardship for the American people, I think it would be less hardship than being led into a third world war that goes nuclear.
I agree with you. But, you know, where else are we going to go to make a new America? This was the great experiment of freedom, right? I mean, now the whole planet's been conquered. Where else are we going to go? I think it's probably the only way out of this is to strap on a yellow vest and hope that it goes global. Maybe we can very peacefully just march through the streets in great enough numbers that it would be a public media faux pas for him to just shoot them all. Maybe we could actually make some change.
I don't want to advocate violence.
I don't see enough people getting off their couches. No violence, never violence, but I don't see enough people getting off their couches and even walking the street peacefully. At least France has got it right, but I'm afraid America's probably done for at this point. Nobody's getting up and doing anything.
I disagree. Really sad to see. I disagree with you, and that's because a month ago,
I hope you're right.
Looking at France, you would have thought everything was more or less okay. Same thing with Romania before their revolution. A month before that happened, you would look at the people and say they seem to be okay with things. You never know when that flashpoint is going to hit, and I think
you've got a good point.
Yeah, I think if you go back to the top of the show where I was talking, where suicide is at a 50-year high in this country, obviously our population is under severe pressure, and there could be just a single spark that sets it all off, and nobody knows where it's going to come from. But we're already seeing the Yellow Vests protests spreading to other countries in the EU. It could come here. I mean, we're not mandated to wear yellow vests, but I mean, that same thing. This could be the start, or at least the acceleration of the grand global awakening, which was a name that was given to this phenomenon by Zbigniew Brzezinski. But of course, in his view, that was a negative thing. They didn't want the world's population to wake up to what was actually going on.
I agree with you in a lot of respects there, Mike. The thing I'm most worried about is, like, on one hand, while we see France actually uniting as a populace for a common cause, over here in America, all we have is, like, a bunch of folks either running around out there wearing transgendered hats, or we, like up in Portland, we see two different protest groups so busy fighting each other that they can't even understand who their common enemy might be. And it's just, it disgusts me. I just had my 60th birthday few days ago on the 2nd, and you know, I've seen a lot of things come and go in this country, and I never thought it would come to this. I never thought I'd see it like this.
No, it's the same with me. When I was a kid, I would have been stunned if you said this was what the United States was going to be like in the year 2018. But again,
I'd have called you a liar. I'd have called you a liar and told you to go take some medication. Well, now I know what the medications are doing to people too, so I wouldn't recommend that. But
true.
No, it's all just gone so south. I don't even understand where to turn.
Yeah,
I don't think I'm the only one feeling that way.
No, you're not. You're not. Go back to that story I just did, where they did a study of high schoolers and found out half of them don't trust the corporate media. And that means that half are out there on the internet looking through the independent media, finding out what's really going on. And of course, they're talking to each other as well. There could be a mass uprising in this country. And I'm not talking about one of these manufactured for the media ones like Antifa and Black Lives Matter. I'm talking about ordinary Americans who are just fed up with all of this nonsense.
Well, I hope we all have ham radios, because if this really goes off for real, you know the media is not going to cover it.
Oh, absolutely. Ham radios would be really good.
As the old saying goes, I think they say the revolution will not be televised.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think that was a foreshadow of the truth.
It may be. Now, of course, the good news is, for those of you who are thinking about getting into ham radio, they no longer require Morse code, which is a stumbling block for so many people. Anyway, Robert, we're going to let you go. Thank you for the phone call. We're going to do a shout out to our on-air affiliates who are just
have a wonderful day, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Who are just now rejoining our network. So let's get them back here to Deutsche Bank. We've seen what happens when smaller financial institutions collapse, like Lehman Brothers. They get bailed out or bailed in. What happens with a bank that is so big and so global that when it goes down, there just simply isn't enough money to bail it out? Who's going to get affected? Right now, Deutsche Bank is in a lot of trouble. They've had scandal after scandal after scandal. They're now caught up in yet another money laundering scandal. And we're seeing this situation where the banks are just looking out for themselves. They're making their money. They're waiting for the crash. the crash for them will be a good thing because they'll come on in with more of this instantly created money and they'll buy up all the hard assets for dirt cheap. And then when the dust settles, they'll wait for the next generation to come along and they'll start the process all over again. Here, have a home mortgage. All right, we're going to take another call from Rattlebone out in Colorado Springs. Aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, sir. I just called. I adore your program. Thank you for teaching me so much. I just wanted to say that my girlfriend and I have joined Front Sight. And I, with all sincerity, thank you for promoting that and the manner in which you did. And for that being something that, man, I'm just telling everybody that I know to please go ahead and join. And I just want to sincerely thank you and the station for making that possible.
Well, you are very welcome, and it is a fabulous offer. And if I lived in the Western United States, I'd take them up on it myself because gun safety, being able to handle your weapons is so important. One of the problems that we have is Hollywood tends to make guns look like toys. They just, swing them around here. They put them over the shoulder. They shove them down their pants. And people who are watching these TV shows and movies, they get very bad ideas about the proper handling of these firearms. And so...
Yes, sir. Indeed. In my circle of friends, I was advertising yesterday, and a gentleman said, "Oh, well, I've learned kind of by accident, now by hit or miss." And I said, we came from California over to Colorado Springs, and I want to do this right. I want the education. I'm going to take classes. I joined the shooting center, and when it gets too cold here for me as a California transplant, I'm going to go over there to Las Vegas, and thaw out. But I want to learn it. I want to get rid of all the old information in my brain and just be a sieve, not a sieve, but a sponge for all of these great individuals that promote firearm safety. And that's the only way to, man, if people would stop taking antidepressants and going on these shooting sprees, blah, blah, blah. Thank you, sir.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I'm glad the Front Sight deal worked out for you. And the gun grabbers are out there. They hate things like this. I think that's one of the reasons why John Stedmiller did it, was just to annoy those gun grabbers. But obviously, yes, Republic Broadcasting does need the financial support here. All the big money goes to the liars.
Yep.
You should see the salaries of those people who are on those TV sets telling you that, war with Russia is good and war with China is good. And you'll never see them go. Anyway.
No, never.
All right, well, thank you for the phone call.
You, sir.
Have a good day.
All
right, we're going to let you go. Getting on back to the economic news here. Interestingly enough, yesterday the European Commission unveiled a plan to reduce dollar hegemony in global trade and expanding the euro's global role. Now, that's going to put the EU directly at odds with the United States and its Federal Reserve, and that is going to perhaps complicate the situation. What's the United States going to do? Declare war on Europe now? So they stopped short of saying they wanted to break the dollar's dominance, but it's basically being implied. Now, the European economy is comparable to the U.S. economy in scale, but the euro is still presumed to have the back seat. That could change very, very rapidly here. Meanwhile, over at the White House, they're having to walk back Trump's victory lap on the Chinese trade deal. Now, the White House statement from back on the 1st did not mention any agreement on auto tariffs or anything about the Chinese tariffs at all. It was very vague on Trump's claim about farmers. China has agreed to start purchasing agricultural product from our farmers immediately. And remember when that came out, I said, I don't think that's going to work because China does not allow GMO, and too much of America's agriculture is contaminated with GMO. So apparently Tuesday, Trump walked back his assertion that there was a deal with China. And there may not be a deal after all. And they're trying to say that that's the reason for the stock market drop. But again, it reveals just how fragile the market is. All right, let's talk about OPEC. Qatar's decision to quit OPEC is raising questions about the future of the oil cartel. This is basically a confirmation of the comment I made. I think just yesterday, we could be seeing the beginning of the breakup here. This is coming from Middle East Monitor. And apparently, there are fears about a sudden meltdown. Apparently, Iraq is now making noises about leaving OPEC. And even more interesting here, Iran is saying that, there we go, Iran is saying that they refuse to follow the OPEC directive to cut oil output until the sanctions against Iran are lifted. Now, that's going to put a lot of pressure on OPEC, obviously. OPEC's going to try and convince the U.S. to back off the sanctions. The U.S. is going to say no. So now we're going to have OPEC in an adversarial position. And, you know, when OPEC gets into an adversarial position with the United States, bad things happen, like oil and gas shortages. Now, the United States may be thinking that's no longer a threat because they've built up our production capacity here in the United States. But to me, it's still a lousy way to be doing business with all this chest thumping and arm twisting and, you know, we don't care if they've got a better product, you will buy from us. Over at General Motors, remember General Motors are now Government Motors, you know, back when things were really melting down. They got $11 billion, that's with a B, in subsidies and slashed wages. And they're still in economic trouble. And so they've announced they're closing factories. The American factories, not the Mexican factories. And workers are already protesting at some of these GM factories in America. It's just plain corporate greed, out of control, rampant corporate greed. Now, we all know that one of the problems is that everything is taxed way too much. We're dealing with exactly the same kind of abusive taxation that they are in France. The other is the out of control executive pay. I mean, if you look at executive pay for U.S. CEOs, CFOs, COOs, and so forth, compared to the same positions in companies in other countries, it's just completely out of skew. It's just completely out of skew. And obviously, in order to have these huge multi-million-dollar salaries for these executives, well, that ultimately percolates down to the cost of the car, which means ultimately you're paying for it all. Now, pharmacy workers over at Bayer are protesting the plan to lay off 12,000 workers around the world. Bayer is saying they're not going to really start the layoffs until 2025, but apparently a significant number of the job cuts at Bayer will be in Germany. Now, Bayer is in trouble because they bought Monsanto without doing due diligence on how harmful some of those products are, or maybe they just didn't care. Remember, Bayer was the company that manufactured a hemophilia medication that was contaminated with HIV. This goes back to that Arkansas tainted blood, prison blood scandal. And when Bayer couldn't sell it in the United States, they simply shipped it to countries where there were no laws against it, and they sold it there. And they gave a lot of hemophiliacs HIV. But it makes money, and that's good, and that's all that really matters in the United States of America. All right, let's get on back here to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And it is a point of major contention between Russia and the United States and Ukraine and Europe, because this will be a second transit pipeline, one that will go around Ukraine. That's what the U.S. is complaining about. And the U.S. is out there screaming that, as soon as Nord Stream 2 is completed, Russia is going to shut that valve going through Ukraine, and that will be horrible. Well, apparently, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, no, that's not a guarantee. That after the launch of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, Russian gas transit through Ukraine into Europe may be continued. Everything he said depends on the Ukrainian side. That Ukraine is not going to basically interfere with it. Meanwhile, John Bolton is out there saying, well, we have to stop that. The U.S. is mulling over a variety of things to stop the Nord Stream 2 construction. And they're already talking about more sanctions. How dare you build a pipeline? Those are our pipelines. We'll be right back after these few words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And again, if you would like to help out Republic Broadcasting, and Republic Broadcasting needs your help, the postal address to send a check, money order, or if you prefer anonymity, cash, is Republic Broadcasting Network, 2251 Double Creek Drive, number 302, Round Rock, Texas, 78664. The phone number to call in with a credit card or debit card donation or to pledge to be a recurring subscriber is 800-724-2719, extension 1 during business hours. And remember, it is Round Rock, Texas, extension 3 at all other times. Okay, I'm looking at the corporate media. We're getting to the end of this thing with Bush. They've got him now at the Presidential Library, which is where he's going to be interred. They did the same thing with Richard Nixon, as I recall here. I don't think the pharaohs got a send-off like this. Anyway, really over the top. All right, let's grab a couple of phone calls real quick. Glenn in Philadelphia, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Mike. Hi. Thinking about the oil issue and the OPEC and all that. I'm sure you remember a few years ago when Pastor Lindsey Williams was making the talk show rounds as vigorously as he was able. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe you might have had him on a few times. Did you not?
I don't think so. I think you're confusing me with another show.
Well, well, he was on a number of shows. He was a retired chaplain who had worked for an oil company up in the Alaska pipeline.
Oh, yes, you're right. Now I remember we did have him on the show.
Right. He now at the time, he characterizes himself as having been in, the service to the elite. But but the oil folks are only one segment of the elite. But anyway, he used to say that their plan was to get the price of oil up to $150 a barrel, and that was where they were going with it. But within the next several years, of course, it went the other way, went down to like 50. But he used to speak often of the available oil off of Gull Island. I believe it's up off the left.
Yes.
And this huge transportable rig called the Liberty rig, and how once all this was pressed into service, there would be no need for any reliance whatsoever upon foreign oil, et cetera, et cetera. Now, fracking and shale deposits aside, here in the lower 48, I've often heard it asserted that we've always had sufficient oil reserves to be independent, but we chose to participate in the international market for the sake of international economic influence and control.
Yes.
Pricing and how the and actually, in a way, we've heard more and more about these various oil deposits being found oil off in Israel, of all places. It used to be the standing joke that Golda Meir used to say that, So the point is that oil, this idea is that the world is awash in oil ultimately, and that, we have more than enough supply to be independent. And which, of course, would have a tendency of a downward pressure on pricing. So, I'm just throwing that out there, just, by way of remembrance to say, okay, so why do we need to worry so much about OPEC if ultimately the world is really has a lot more oil than people were?
The worry about OPEC is not about oil, it's about continuing the petrodollar deal. If OPEC breaks up, that's going to be the beginning of the end of the U.S. dollar's hegemonic domination of the globe.
Right, and that's the obvious answer to the question. Yeah, exactly. And supposedly that's why we participated so much in international trade of oil for precisely that reason. We didn't really need to. We could have kept our little World War I sense of isolationism, as we're always accused of having. We could always just be independent and say, we're just happy, we're fine. But that's not going to happen because it's not in American interests or in corporate interests. The same reason we do wars. We're not defending America or its borders. We defend corporate interests around the world.
Yes.
A la Smedley Butler.
Yes.
Stuff. Yeah. So anyway, I just, thought I'd bring this out that it's ultimately all economic, So anyway.
It's all driven by greed. Okay, anything else, Glenn?
Exactly. All right, Mike. No, that's it. I just wanted to highlight, it's stuff within recent memory that was very hot a couple of years ago, very, very, very hot. But now it's I think maybe it's kind of become perhaps obvious to all to some degree. We'll have to see. All right, Mike, thank you.
All right, thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go here, and I've got another caller on the line, but I think I'm going to just leave you until we come back from these words from our sponsors. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're going to go back to the phones to Tony in Puerto Rico. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Tony, are you there?
You hear me?
Yes, I hear you now. You're on the air.
You hear me?
I hear you.
Okay.
You're on the air.
Okay. I hope Claire's feeling better. Listen, Mike, I have a hypothetical question. And I hope the people out there who are Bush haters, please forgive me for what I'm about to say. Do you think in 1,000 years George Bush will be forgiven? And if that's a United Earth Federation typical to the one of Star Trek, they'll give credit to what George Bush said about the world order.
Well, history is a funny thing. It's written by the victors over the vanquished. It's a joke played by the victors on the vanquished in front of an audience that dares not laugh. And the official history of George Herbert Walker Bush is being written right now. And so it will be the expectation that we will look at him positively from now on. And the fact that he did some things that were less than wonderful, well, that's the realm of these little academics over there, and nobody pays attention to them. So, actually, in 1,000 years, I rather think that hardly anybody will remember any of our presidents. I don't think they'll even remember the United States of America all that much.
Okay, even if this World Earth Federation like Star Trek, they won't give Bush credit for what he said as the world order?
I don't think so. I don't think so, because what the New World Order is about is certainly not like the hypothetical, Federation of Planets. I mean, that's science fiction, okay? But if there was a
but fiction sometimes is real.
Hang on.
Okay, I'm sorry.
If there is, in 1,000 years, some kind of one world government based on the behavior of large governments in history and in the current day, I imagine that the study of history will be discouraged. And no, they will not give him credit.
Okay. Thank you, Mike.
All right, thanks an awful lot. Time makes ancient truth uncouth. Okay, so getting on back here, we're talking about the economy, we're talking about the possible breakup of OPEC and the ramifications it would have on the petrodollar deal. Interestingly enough, Russia and Venezuela just signed a $5 billion investment deal to increase Venezuelan oil production. So Russia's now down in Venezuela, and hopefully that will deter those in our government, or the U.S. government, they're not my government anymore, who are talking about we need military action down there because they won't do what we tell them to do. Well, between Tuesday and earlier today on the stock market, investors are clearly getting very nervous. And like I said, if there's one thing we know for certain based on what happened, it's that the stock markets are actually very, very fragile right now. Everybody is skittish. They're ready to bail. Apparently, panic buying has hit the palladium market, which is considered one of the more investment-worthy metals here. Meanwhile, Rob Kirby is saying there's an epic amount of physical precious metals are being withdrawn and memory hold using off-market transactions. Now, are they trying to create an artificial shortage, or are they trying to basically get the precious metals someplace where they can't be gotten at when things start to come apart? But people are definitely going to be taking notice at how the metals are starting to move around. Okay, now then, let's talk about Great Britain. Oh boy, things over in Great Britain. The Brexit, it's tearing the country apart. The British government is in chaos. The British people are seriously angry, and I would hope that the British government would just look across that little 22-mile stretch of water and see what's going on in France. Because I think the British people could be close to the same thing. And unfortunately, Theresa May and the Remainers are still trying to find some way they can scuttle this deal and take it away from the British voters. The latest tactic, okay, is the European Union is going to offer to extend Article 50 beyond the March deadline next year if Theresa May loses the parliamentary vote on the withdrawal agreement. In other words, it'll move to March of 2020. Give the Remainers more time to try and subvert what's going on with the Brexit. May is due to travel to Brussels on December 13th, 2 days after the parliamentary vote on the 11th. And the report is saying that EU leaders would be open to the idea of extending the Article 50 process if it meant avoiding a no-deal Brexit. I think that is probably going to put things over the top for the British people here. Meanwhile, 78% of the Tory members are now opposed to continuing leadership of Theresa May. This is coming out of the Orpington Conservative Association's political forum. They took a poll. 78% of the Tory members. And the Tories, that's Theresa May's party. That's like saying 78% of Republicans don't like Donald Trump. Nigel Farage is saying that if May loses this vote on December 11th, and right now it looks like she will lose by about 100 votes, there will be a crisis. And Nigel Farage is saying this is going to lead to the Remainers demanding a second Brexit referendum, and they'll just hire twice as many vote riggers this time. But right now, I can imagine the British people are very, very angry at a government which clearly is trying to steal Brexit from the British people. Top Tories are saying that if May does lose that vote on the 11th, she will be forced to resign. All right, let's take a phone call here from Dave in Los Angeles. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Dave, are you there?
Always. You know, I've been waiting. Yeah, this is Dave. You hear me? And I've been watching all the George H.W. Bush all week and have been waiting for anybody and somebody to challenge the conventional story about his World War II plane crash incident. And apparently in 1984, there was another man, Majoyski, who was the tail gunner on the plane in front of young George Bush's plane, who certainly questioned the version of the story that Bush had always said. He said, that there were no parachutes that came out of the plane besides George Bush, and there was no smoke that came out of the canopy when he ejected. So that is in direct contradiction to what George Herbert Walker Bush always claimed, that he tried to get the other guys out or told them to get out. So the reality
well,
is...
wait a minute. Dave.
Yeah,
George Herbert Walker Bush in World War II flew a dive bomber. That's a single-seat airplane. There was no other crew to get out, as far as I'm aware.
Oh, well, I have to tell you, there actually was a tail gunner, and there was a radio man underneath who is under. It's a pretty large plane. It's literally a bomber, and it's not necessarily. It was not a small fighter. I can't tell you the exact model, but the point is there were two other people, and I would just challenge or would recommend somebody take a look. In 1988, actually, the New York Post wrote an article about this, and I just like all of us truth seekers, I just seek the truth. And it just seems apparent. I've been waiting all week for anybody and somebody to question the accepted version and facts of it. And so I just wanted to let you know there's more to the story than what a lot of people might think. And I would recommend anybody with naval aviation experience or knowledge on the topic to please corroborate either the article I'm reading or if they have any opinions. But thank you very much for the opportunity, and I just want you to know there's probably more to the story than anybody's talking about. Thank you very much.
All right, well, I'll take a look into that. Thank you very much. We're going to let you go. The phone lines are open. All right. Getting on back to Brexit and the European Union. Apparently, Germany has basically issued a warning over the Brexit burden. Now, when Brexit first came on up, Germany said, yeah, we will be able to cover the shortfall when Great Britain leaves the EU, because Great Britain and Germany were basically holding up the rest of the EU with all those other countries who were in serious economic problems. Of course, the German people weren't too happy about that. But that was then, and this is now, and Germany is saying, because of the downturn in the economy, and especially because of the extreme financial burden of the open borders policy and all the migrants, they can no longer guarantee to cover that shortfall. In other words, they're sending a warning: find a way to keep Great Britain in the EU or you're going to run out of money. Now, Orban is over there saying that he hopes the recent European elections are going to result in politicians who understand it's a very different era. And this is an interesting statement he made. He said the Commission needs new members who will redirect this institution from an ill-advised political path to where it belongs. It is up to member states to set directions rather than Commission, and added, we don't need a Politburo. Boy, did he hit that right on the head. Because that's what the EU Commission, that's what Brussels has been evolving toward. The EU started originally simply as a free trade zone, open border zone, Schengen, and over the years, Brussels just grabbed more and more and more power and authority to itself. And they do act like a Politburo. They have extremely intrusive, almost trivial rules and laws that are being passed on to the EU member states, and that's probably another reason why the Europeans are fed up with this whole thing. Okay, apparently over in Germany, a 27-year-old asylum seeker from Cameroon, Lois Sindbad, admitted to killing a 54-year-old pastor, Alain Florent Grandulu, who was from the Congo himself, while he prayed in Berlin. Apparently this happened a while ago, but apparently it just basically shows when you just let people into your country and you don't know anything about them, you don't know what you're going to get. Now, as far as our border is concerned, finally, finally, the mayor of Tijuana is calling for the arrest of the organizers of the migrant caravans. Now, he may be a little bit late because earlier in the week we reported on how these organizers apparently had just given up and started leaving. But if there are any still there, they're about to get sent to the Huskow, as it were, here. Okay, here's another good one. Over in Massachusetts, there was a criminal illegal who was in court on drug charges as well as a Pennsylvania warrant for drunk driving. And the judge, Shelley Joseph, allowed this guy to walk out the back door of the courthouse to avoid immigration enforcement officers who had arrived to arrest him. And this guy has apparently been deported from the United States twice before. Just getting weird out there. Okay. Interestingly enough, over at Stanford University, there is a fraternity called Sigma Chi. And it's actually rather famous. It's even been immortalized in songs. And apparently there was the situation where Sigma Chi had come into some disrepute. And apparently the solution being suggested by a Stanford University administrator is that Sigma Chi take down the American flag flown in front of the fraternity house in order to improve its image on campus. Because after all, the American flag is intimidating and it's non-inclusive. I'm sorry, Stanford, you'll get my American flag when you pry it from my cold, dead hands. I may not like the government, but I love the nation, I love the Constitution, I love its people, and yes, I do have an American flag. Over at Facebook, this is getting weird. This whole thing about Christmas is just being torn apart here. Apparently, Facebook censored a photo of Santa Claus kneeling in front of Jesus' manger because according to Facebook's guidelines, the photo may show violent or graphic content. We're not kidding. When you went to this page, which is run by obviously a Christian group, the image was covered over with a blur and the warning that said may show violent or graphic content. And they still gave people the option to see it. They wanted to see it. But apparently, according to Facebook, violence or graphic content is defined as an image some people might find objectionable. Well, I'm sorry. This is a large planet. And these days, everybody's being encouraged to be hypersensitive. No matter what picture you put up on Facebook, someplace, somewhere is going to find it objectionable. And we're seeing this hypersensitivity being weaponized, where there's a culture war that is basically trying to sort of reverse things that were before. Homosexuals are out of the closet. That's a good thing. But all of a sudden, heterosexuals are being told to get back in the closet. Don't say you're male or female. That's just completely nonsense. You're somewhere in between. They're trying to sell the idea that everybody is gender fluid. And if you don't think you are, go into the closet. Same thing with Christianity. They're trying to shove it in the closet because it's offending the Muslims and it's offending the Jews, and we can't have that. It really is getting ridiculous out there. Okay, we got to take another break for commercials, and we'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And before we go back to the phones here, during the commercial break, I hunted down the plans for the TBM Avenger, which was the aircraft flown by George Herbert Walker Bush in World War II. And looking at it, the first thing that jumps out is that the pilot can exit the aircraft through the overhead canopy, which is generally kind of normal. But both the radio operator and the turret gunner have their own exit. It's another hatch on the starboard side aft of the wings. So there was no way that George Herbert Walker Bush, or for that matter, any pilot, could actually get to them to try and render assistance. because right behind the pilot's seat was this steel bulkhead to protect him from bullets coming in from the rear. So that settles that. Okay, back to the phones. Terry in California, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, Big Swear says that Deutsche Bank is way overextended with derivatives, and all those things have to do is just lean the wrong way, and then the whole thing's going to come down. And he says all the banks in the European Union are connected.
Yes.
So it'll start a domino effect, and then they're actually connected to the banks in the United States. It's all networked together, and when that happens, it's going to set in motion a world banking crisis that could affect everybody. So as soon as you hear about Deutsche Bank, anything negative, you better get your money out of the bank. For those who have any money in the bank, I don't keep money in the bank much. Just my Social Security check goes in there, and I spend it right away.
Yes.
So anyway, if that happened and the OPEC broke up, the U.S. dollar declined, it's all over.
Yeah, it would be a complete and total reset. I mean, the global derivatives exposure on paper is more than the entire planet is worth. And again, it's a case of the money junkies getting their pet Congress critters to write laws that let them play these games. Because, when the economy's going up, derivatives are a great way to make a huge amount of money very quickly. But when you get caught on that downside, it's a problem. That's what took down AIG and Lehman Brothers back in 2008, is they got caught with the derivatives traffic.
Well, this is a good reason to be a prepper, and that's what I'm going to do. Anyway, I just want to make that point. Thanks, Mike. Talk to you later.
All right, thanks an awful lot here. And we have another caller, but I think I'm going to leave you until after station identification. Getting on back to Facebook, which seems to think Santa Claus is offensive. Apparently, they have lost their top spot on Glassdoor's Best Places to Work list. Apparently, employees have developed a bunker mentality following all these scandals that have come on out. Facebook ranked #1 last year. It's now 7th. We'll be back after station identification. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. We're going to go back to the phones to Paul in New Jersey. Aloha, Paul. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Michael. Michael, since the death of George Bush, I wasn't too keen when he and with the in the name of the United States invaded Panama, which led to the death of at least 1,000 Panamanian civilians, all to arrest Manuel Noriega and then bring him to the United States to serve a 40-year sentence in Florida.
Well, Noriega tried to blackmail the Bush family over the Iran-Contra cocaine smuggling because Panama was being used as a transshipment point.
Yeah, but I am really disgusted with the behavior of our country. I was disgusted with it back then, that we think we can play Globo Cop and go around and arresting foreigners in their countries and then have them sent to the United States and imprisoned at American taxpayers' expense. We have El Chapo right now is in New York, and he's going to be, tried because of being the drug lord in Mexico. Why can't Mexico do it down there, right?
Well, I would suspect that probably, first of all, we know, again, going back to Iran-Contra, the CIA is very much tangled up in drug smuggling. That actually goes all the way back to the Reagan administration and his Attorney General, William French Smith, who literally wrote the rules saying that the CIA did not have to report any drug activity they encountered during intelligence operations to the DEA. Well, the CIA took advantage of that and basically called it was their license to smuggle. And that's what led to all of this Iran-Contra. And it's not like they haven't been dealing in illicit substances all along. They were funding operations during Vietnam by bringing heroin back into the United States. So I think probably with El Chapo is that, like Manuel Noriega, he got a little too big for his britches, and they're trying to make an example out of him to keep the other Mexican cartel leaders in line.
Because with El Chapo, I don't see. He might have been a drug lord in Mexico, and he might have sent his drug couriers into the United States to bring drugs into the United States. In that case, I put the fault on a lack of border control in the United States, and don't necessarily see the crime he committed in the United States until he sets foot in this country. See, and that's part of the problem I have with these, what I would consider extrajudicial arrests of foreigners. Now, this is, there's a big brouhaha going on now because we arrested a CFO of a telecom company in Canada. I think her name is Meng Wanzhou.
Well, actually, Canadian authorities arrested her at the request of the United States. It's not quite the same thing as we went over the border into Canada, grabbed her, and dragged her back kicking and screaming. It's still sparking an international incident, however.
Yes, and what it really is, it's a wanton and global display, and I urge all our Chinese friends out there who are listening to be, to just take note that the United States is so slavish towards the state of Israel, so slavish in the neocon agenda of fighting Israel's enemies for them, that we will alienate 1.3 billion Chinese potential customers by this ongoing hatred towards the Iranians and how we're enforcing sanctions on Iran. And that's what this crime of this woman, what she did. She was probably trying to sell cell phones instead of Apple cell phones to the Iranians. And so because of that, we're alienating 1.3 billion Chinese. 70 million Iranians have been alienated from the United States a long time ago, all to curry favor to this tiny little state of Israel of about, 8 million people, somewhere in that ballpark, 9 million.
Yeah.
So it really shows the sick priorities of the United States foreign policy, and also it undermines their claim of being for free trade. Because isn't that we've been told all the while, free trade is good, free trade will lift all boats, free trade will raise the standard of living and cause peace in the world because trading partners don't wage war against each other. And now the Chinese are seeing the abuse of somebody. She's prominent. She's a CFO.
Yeah.
Chief Financial Officer. She's a bigwig. And that because of American power and the weakness of Canada also to American power, we're going to have this woman extradited and tried in the United States.
Yep.
Just because we said on the global scale, nobody is supposed to do any business with Iran. And it really shows what a despicable, disgraceful foreign policy we have, what a despicable, actually I consider Donald Trump, forget about it, he's despicable to me now, worshiping money over decency. And we've seen that from the way he curries favor to the Saudis. If you're going to talk about nations in the Middle East that are tyrannical, don't look at Iran, look at Saudi Arabia first. At least Iran has election. Saudi Arabia has no elections whatsoever, and they have a king.
Yes.
An absolute despot, and who just murdered a journalist in Turkey at their embassy. And yet, we're working with this sick campaign of warring with the Russians, trying to get the last peg in the neocon hit list, which is Iran. And now we're alienating 1.3 billion Chinese in the process. It's just disgraceful.
Yes, it is. And it's an imperial mindset, and I think they're going to set the world on fire. Anyway, listen, Paul, going to let you go here. Got a lot of news to get through before the end of the show here. We're going to do a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. And getting on back to the news, finishing up here with Facebook. Facebook's total value of the company has now plunged by $9.5 billion when the markets open. Apparently, there's been a document leak showing Facebook is anti-competitive. They apparently aggressively pursued competitors, used its platform to try and cripple rivals, and leveraged developers for advertising money. Very unethical business dealing. By the way, somebody just sent me in this comment here that the Christmas song, All I Want for Christmas Are My Two Front Teeth, has to be banned now because it's offensive to the meth heads. All right, over in Sweden, there's a newspaper, Sydsvenskan. It's a regional daily headquartered in Skane County. And apparently it was publishing an article about how Christmas celebrations are being moved from the Gustav Adolf Square to a safer location at Stortorget because there had been an attack by migrants on the Christmas fair last year. Where they goofed up is they described it as winter celebrations, saying that they didn't want to offend anybody. And of course, they succeeded in offending all of the Christians around them. Okay, this is just getting out there. Over in Nebraska, at Manchester Elementary School in Omaha, I should know that better. I've been there. The principal came out with a memo of items that are banned for the holiday season. And apparently this includes any Santas or Christmas items, clip art on worksheets. No Christmas trees will be allowed. No elf on the shelf because that's linked to Christmas. You're not allowed to sing Christmas carols or play Christmas music. You're not allowed to send a scholastic book that is a Christmas book or that's Christmas related. You're not allowed to make a Christmas ornament as a gift. This assumes that the family has a Christmas tree, which assumes they celebrate Christmas. He's banning candy canes. That's Christmas related because the shape is a J for Jesus. Actually, no, it's supposed to be a shepherd's crook. He's banning any items in red and green because of the traditional Christmas colors. No reindeer allowed, no Christmas videos, movies, or characters. It's nuts. It's just absolute nuts. That other article is right. Yeah, the Christians are being shoved in the closet here, along with heterosexuals. And here's another story that basically says the same thing. There's this Association of University and College Faculty and other professionals called the American Association of University Professors, AAUP, founded in 1915. And it just released a statement in which it condemned all attempts to define gender as biologically determined at birth, insisting that the traditional position regarding gender has been thoroughly discredited by over 50 years of feminist, trans, queer, and critical race research and by live experience. They're basically saying there is no such thing as two genders. Now, AAUP made the news before for attacking the Hungarian government for prohibiting gender studies courses in all universities. And by the way, what kind of a job are you going to get with a college degree in gender studies with which to pay off those student loans, I'd like to ask? AAUP attacked the Trump administration for pursuing a legal definition of gender that would define it as a biological, immutable condition determined at birth. And Trump didn't do that to offend anybody. He did it to keep the federal paperwork simple because all the LGBTQ, PFD, BFD, LSMFT people out there, wanted a separate box for all the some 30 different genders they now think are out there. AAUP basically attacked Poland, Brazil, and Bulgaria for their attempts to define gender traditionally. And the AAUP complained, authoritarian efforts such as this can justify racial, class, and sexual policing that disciplines forms of kinships and homemaking. So the AAUP concluded that defining gender traditionally poses a threat to academic freedom. Well, that tells us that academia has gone off into fantasy land. They want to believe there's 142 genders. My academic freedom requires the freedom to believe in 167 genders. Pretty intense over there. Okay. As you know, over in the EU, they've passed this new, very strict copyright law that's supposed to be protecting big media from copyright infringement. And one of the worst rules is Article 13, which requires all but the smallest online platforms to censor their users' videos, text messages, photos, and audio if they appear to match anything in a copyrighted works database, which, by the way, that database is crowdsourced, which means it may not even be accurate. Interestingly enough, European film companies and sport leagues are saying, no, we don't want this. It's going to make big tech stronger, and they're already have way too much power and influence over us. So there may be an interesting little fight over there. Okay, if you have Adobe Flash, there's a new zero-day exploit that's been found hidden inside Microsoft Office documents, which explains why these people I've never heard from keep sending me all these Word documents saying, you've got to see this, it's great, it's going to work, it's doing this. And I bit bucket them all the time here. But apparently this vulnerability impacts Flash Player versions 31.0.0.153 and earlier for products including Flash Player Desktop Runtime, Flash Player for Google Chrome, Microsoft Edge, and Internet Explorer 11. Adobe Flash Player installer versions 31.0.0.108 and earlier are also affected. Now, Adobe is already out there releasing updated versions to close that exploit. But what they've unfortunately allowed to happen, computer crime is a crime, and it should be treated as a crime. And instead, they've turned it into just another video game. I've got an exploit. Well, I will defeat your exploit, and I will do something back to you. Oh, no, I've got another over here. And, you know, I'm a better tech genius than you are because I can wreck your systems here. Here's an interesting little story. Apparently over at Amazon in New Jersey, 24 Amazon workers were sent to the hospital because a robot that was moving cargo around the warehouse tore open a can of what's called bear spray in a warehouse. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, we've all seen pepper spray. It comes in different strengths, and by far the worst is what's called bear spray, because bears are big, they get angry, and you need to really give them motivation to not come and eat you. So the 24 workers had to go to 5 local hospitals. One was in critical condition. A little bit of a whoopsie there. More concerns are being raised about privacy. This is over in the Daily Mail. And they're just out there saying everything is being harvested by big firms. Children's voice recordings, passport info, even the pregnant mother's due dates, so they can send them targeted advertising for disposable diapers or whatever. And it's just wide open on your privacy. And it's a little unsettling because as far as the mass marketing part of it is concerned, I'm not that worried. But this data is all out there, and it can and is being hacked by people who are going to put it to nefarious purposes. Now, turning over to London and specifically the Ecuadorian embassy, we have 2 conflicting stories on what's going on with Julian Assange. Russia Today came on out and said that Great Britain has provided guarantees that Julian Assange will not be extradited to any nation where he could face the death penalty when he leaves the Ecuadorian embassy in London. This is according to Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno. And Moreno said that his administration has received these written assurances that Great Britain will not extradite Assange to any nation where he could face the death penalty. Well, apparently Julian Assange himself is not so sure, because we have this other story in which, basically, to put it in the short version, he doesn't think Moreno is telling the truth here. He's rejecting President Lenin Moreno's claim that he can leave the embassy with near liberty. So this is getting more and more bizarre. I mean, at some point, Ecuador can just physically eject him. Okay, now, speaking of Assange, this whole blow-up with The Guardian is really embarrassing. And apparently, it goes back to that article. The Guardian wrote a story about how Paul Manafort had met repeatedly with Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy, and that this represented a link between the Trump campaign and Russia. Collusion. We're going to get the collusion. And the story was almost instantly discredited. The logs at the Ecuadorian embassy don't support it. The passport stamps on Paul Manafort's passport don't support it. And even the Washington Post denounced The Guardian, saying it's just bad journalism. All right. So, speaking of the Front Sight Firearms Academy, a little statistic. There's been a new study that has come on out showing that armed citizens thwart active shooters 94% of the time. If you're in a gun-free zone, you're a target. If you're not, then you can protect yourself. We got to take a break for commercials. We will be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. Now, as you know, there is this hashtag #MeToo movement, and it just took off following the attempt to tarnish Brett Kavanaugh's reputation with what were accusations that were free of any evidence whatsoever. Not only that, they were very, very old. Why'd you wait this long? Well, I didn't realize he was going to be a Supreme Court nominee. But there have been so many women who came out with these things, and already many of them have been discredited. It's already had a backlash. Corporations are starting to impose new rules, which basically are telling their male executives, stay away from women. Now, what's that going to do for the prospects of women getting a job at those companies? I'm sure they're going to go screaming to the government and say, you make them hire us. You make it 50-50. But even if the women get the jobs, they're going to be basically cut out. The problem is the Me Too movement has given women license to accuse men without evidence, out of spite, out of a desire for advancement, out of blackmail. And apparently there is a new trend on out there where men who are out with women are asking the women to make consent videos before sex. In other words, you're getting cozy and cuddly and you're getting ready to go. The guy whips out his cell phone, hits the video record, and says, just say into the camera, I am willing to have sex with you. And, I mean, we're getting bizarre, Twilight Zone. So that's basically it. And the idea is that the guy can protect himself against any future false accusation leveled against him. I guess people are going to save up these consent videos, on a hard drive someplace, or maybe they'll just have them up there as like their scorecard. Look at all these consent videos here. And it's becoming a major trend in the world. Now, legally, a consent video would not necessarily provide blanket coverage, since certain actions might not be covered in the consent video unless described. And of course, the feminists maintain that consent can be withdrawn at any time. I mean, you could be right in the middle of it and she could say, I changed my mind. And that's considered appropriate behavior. But it's nonsense. The feminists are out there saying that basically the implication of a consent video is that those in the position of power, meaning the men, are the ones who need protection. And that's just not true. Well, I think it's a good idea. I think it's a very, very good idea. Okay, as you know, more and more states are starting to legalize recreational marijuana, and this has put the alcohol and tobacco industries in a total blind panic because teenagers are choosing marijuana above other forms of intoxicants. And there's a good reason to do that. It's actually less harmful to your health, for one thing. Alcohol can harm your brain cells. Marijuana actually stimulates the growth of brain cells. I remember when Cheech Marin went on Jeopardy with one of these big corporate media talking heads, I forget which one, just mopped the floor with him. Just mopped the floor with him. So the traditional intoxicant industries are in a panic, and they're already calling up the propaganda war. And over at Fox News, they have this anti-marijuana propaganda 90-second clip about it's killing people every day. I remember when I was a kid and I got to see Reefer Madness. I mean, they made you sit and watch that. Oh, this stuff is bad for you. It's bad for you. And looking back at it in hindsight, it's some of the most ridiculous, overdone propaganda possible. I think the only thing that was more overdone and ridiculous was Bert the Turtle with Duck and Cover. But that's a big part of what the corporate news media is supposed to do. We're going to run stories and articles that help our advertisers and our friends, and we're going to go after the people they don't like. And the history of America's corporate media is filled with literally hundreds of stories of TV news departments literally falsifying news to help out their friends. One of the worst was the ABC Food Lion scandal, which resulted in an absolutely huge settlement when Food Lion sued. Food Lion, basically ABC falsified footage of bad food handling conditions inside the market. We're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. Let's talk about light rail projects. Out in California, they have got themselves a major boondoggle on their hands. And according to this article that came out of Investment Watch blog, analysts are saying that it's mismanaged. California's high-speed rail project has gone on long enough. They've spent a huge amount of money. Apparently, the CHSRA, which is the California High-Speed Rail Association, has wasted huge sums of money through poor management. And apparently, the authority plans to spend billions of dollars to outfit Bay Area stations with unnecessary tunnels and viaducts rather than making elementary improvements to the operations. And a state audit has shown that the rail authority knowingly incurred massive additional cost risks by starting construction prematurely, desperate to show progress and to meet a deadline for federal funds. And apparently, the authority actually began construction in the Central Valley without having bought all the land it needed, or even completing negotiations with the freight railroads whose rights of way it planned to use. Apparently, the authority was hiring expensive consultants over the objection of its former CEO to do routine budgeting work. Now, the reason I'm hitting on this is we have the same problem here. We have a Hawaii light rail project. They're not calling it high speed. In fact, the way the tracks weave back and forth, I don't know that it's going to go all that fast. It has been plagued by problems. It is years behind schedule. It is billions of dollars over budget. There have been calls for an audit, which is being resisted by the rail authority, to nobody's surprise here. And there is now actually talk it may never be completed. And we're going to be left with this eyesore of a rail track running all along the southern part of the island of Oahu. And I mean, some of the problems they've had, but besides wrecking the roads underneath and clogging up traffic, some of the pads for the rail sections have already started to crack. They'd had to be replaced. Some of the tension bars inside the rail sections have already snapped. They've had to be replaced. All of the rail cars that had been delivered at a certain point had to be basically sent back and replaced because the frames were cracked. And the cars are built with these 4 large aluminum I-beams. And because of the way the cars are constructed, it's actually more expensive to try and take them apart and replace those I-beams than it is to simply melt them down and start all over again. But it's a huge amount of money, and the train doesn't really go a lot of places ordinary Oahuans would want to go. It is meant to connect downtown Honolulu with this Kapolei area, which is supposed to be a business incubator. And Kapolei itself was built up, again, with a lot of taxpayer money, with the hope of luring some businesses away from Honolulu and take some of the load off Honolulu's surface streets and parking. That really didn't work out. There are some companies out there, but a lot of those buildings are still empty simply because it takes so long to get from Honolulu to Kapolei on the H1, which is way too narrow for the volume of traffic it carries. They have what's called this zipper lane, where there's this big machine that takes this chain of concrete blocks, and in the morning they move them to one line to provide an extra lane going to the east into Honolulu, and in the afternoon they move it back the other way to provide an extra lane for traffic that is heading back out west. And it's not really an ideal solution. Adding another lane probably would have worked a lot better. But that was the way they went with that. So now after Kapolei basically turned out to be a boondoggle, and they tried all kinds of things. They even had a high-speed hydrofoil that was leaving Honolulu and going out to Kapolei. And that really didn't work out because people were getting seasick. The water can be very rough. And they would have to take additional buses to get to the hydrofoil and from the hydrofoil to Kapolei and back. So that didn't work. So they're building this high-speed rail, and it really is for the benefit of business and tourism. It does hit a lot of the tourist destinations, and it hits all the shopping malls all the way along. They've got a station that they're building right down here at the bottom of the hill, where we can get those customers into the mall here. But it's very badly managed, and there are calls for an audit. During the last election here, one of our local candidates actually campaigned on a promise to stop the rail project. And there's a lot of people who are saying, yeah, they're never going to get this to work. And even if they do, it's not going to benefit me personally. One of the things that I have seen about it is there isn't a lot of parking space around these stations. So that means people can't drive from their home to the station. They're going to have to take another bus. It's very poorly thought out. Very, very poorly thought out. I've been on some public transportation that does work. The trains in Munich ran wonderfully. The stations were all located where I needed to be. Sydney, their train system, it's amazing. And of course, in a highly urban environment like that, you can pretty much walk from the station to where you're going, which is same thing with New York. They've cleaned up their subway system, and that's now running very, very well. But those were well designed and well thought out. This was just, let's just have a train from Honolulu to Kapolei, and we'll throw some of the stuff on the side of it on the way on out there. One of the big problems it has is because it's a large section of it is going down Kamehameha Highway. And in the process, it's having to dodge the intersections, which have these left turn lanes and all the rest of it. So the track, at least for that section, it's literally weaving back and forth, which means it's not going to be able to go all that fast. And probably, if you will remember, a few weeks ago, there was an attempt to send some astronauts to the International Space Station, and it basically failed. There was a failure of the launch vehicle. The astronauts were unharmed, but a little shaken up. Now they've had a second try. The launch went entirely without incident, and the astronauts are now back up there at the International Space Station, so good for them. Up in Alaska, they have recorded more than 1,700 aftershocks since the big quake last Friday. And then, of course, over the weekend, we had another big quake and a lot of aftershocks down in the Loyalty Islands. No tsunami warning from that one. The Earth is really rocking and rolling right now. Now, this is a really cool story, and I really like this. And it has to do with this Sacred Dakota peace pipe. And this pipe was carved. The front of it is made out of what's called pipestone by a Dakota chief named White Dog while he was held prisoner after the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. And apparently he became very good friends with one of his captors, Lieutenant King. And he made up this very nice Native American pipe, and he gave it to him as a gift. And it got passed down and passed down, a museum and so forth and so on. And it was recently put up for auction. And it sold for $40,000 to an anonymous buyer. And that was twice what it was expected to bring at the auction. And this anonymous donor is now giving it back to the Dakota tribe. I think that is very, very cool. And we're at an age right now where we don't need to go around the world pillaging artifacts and putting them in giant museums. I mean, it's cool to see them in real life. Okay, and things like, dinosaur fossils and so forth, they can be anywhere. But I'm starting to agree with those people who are saying that culturally important artifacts that are linked to a specific people really ought to be returned to them. Because in this age of global internet, 4K television, virtual reality, we can look at these things in our homes, on our computers. We can explore them in virtual reality. We can actually see them much more clearly than if we were standing in a museum looking through a glass window. So I would like to see more of that start to happen here. Okay, a little more insanity from the PC people here. PETA has put up a billboard in San Jose claiming that people who eat eggs can't claim to be feminists because the female animals are being sexually exploited for their eggs and milk. And it's blatant misogyny. Now that's a little bit out there. You know, PETA, what does PETA think people are going to eat? Soylent Green? It's amazing. They're trying to link dairy products with feminism. And I'm sure there's a bunch of feminists who are going to fall for it. They're going to go right for it here. Okay, apparently research has confirmed what many chemotherapy patients had reported, which apparently more than half of the patients who receive chemotherapy report sort of being in this fog for months and sometimes years after undergoing the intensive cancer treatment. It was sort of dismissed as they're stressed, they're not sleeping. But apparently a team of Stanford University scientists has identified how the chemicals in chemotherapy affects 3 different types of brain cells, including damaging the white matter. So, bad stuff there here. We've had another incident with a flu shot. This is from Mike Adams over at Natural News. Apparently, a Las Vegas man has lost his vision. He became partially paralyzed. He's been unable to breathe without assistance since getting a flu shot last month. And apparently, a 50-year-old woman died 48 hours after receiving 8 vaccines. So that's real serious stuff here. And again, when you have a society in which the makers of products are indemnified, protected, that they can't be sued for what their products do, they have no incentive to make sure their products are safe or even effective. It's just, let's get something out there. We'll go through the song and dance of getting FDA approval, which is more and more often based on fraudulent scientific papers that are bought and paid for. We talked to, I think it was about a week ago. There's actually a company out there whose entire business is coming up with these bogus scientific papers and then finding scientists or academics who, for a small fee, will submit them as their own to the journals. Then they get back the journal copies, they take them over to the FDA and say, see, this stuff really works. It's amazing. Apparently, the PC industry is now trapped in a battle between the immovable objects that are Intel shortages and consumer demand. And apparently a lot of it has to do with enterprises upgrading to Windows 10, which, let's be honest, it is a system hog. It really is. Microsoft is coming out with yet more fixes for Windows 10 for the October 10th update. You know, the one that had the problem with the disappearing files. They're still trying to find and fix that one. And again, why aren't they trying to fix these things before they go out the door? Why? Because all the way back in the days of the Apple II, Congress passed a law protecting the young, fragile, fledgling computer industry from product liability. And what that basically means is that if you own a business and you buy a truck for your business, and because of a design flaw it crashes and you suffer financial harm, you can sue the truck manufacturer. If you buy a computer system for your company, and because of a design flaw it crashes and you suffer financial harm, you can't sue the computer or software company. One of these days you ought to really go take the trouble to read through that end user license agreement. It's completely one-sided. There's no protection for the consumers. And because marketing is always saying we need more whiz-bang, that's where the R&D effort goes, like that little live tile system on Windows 10, which annoys the heck out of me, rather than going back on in and making sure that core technology actually works. Because that's not what drives the sales. And boy, oh boy, have you seen how they're pushing it for the holiday shopping season? Oh, we got to get a new computer. New computers out there. The sales are on. I remember when I was a kid, we didn't even have Black Friday. We basically had the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. That was the official start of the Christmas shopping season. And then all of a sudden, this Black Friday sales came along. And then more recently, Cyber Monday, a special day to buy computers and electronics and just flog the people out of their money. Okay, we're going to take a break here for commercials. We'll be back with the last segment of our program after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And late-breaking story here. Judicial Watch, as you know, last month appeared in a D.C. federal court on a motion to compel more testimony from Hillary Clinton, as well as to make public video recordings of the depositions of top Clinton aides, Huma Abedin and Cheryl Mills. The court agreed that Hillary had to answer more questions, but denied the request to unseal the video depositions here. Well, things are now accelerating because earlier today, a federal court blasted the Department of Justice and the State Department on Hillary Clinton's emails and ordered a discovery plan in just 10 days as to whether Hillary's private email system was intentionally set up to evade Freedom of Information Act requests and lawsuits, which we know that. Also, federal record-keeping laws. A lot of the stuff that she had on there that should have been turned over to federal records keepers never got there. So, Judicial Watch is out there. They're doing a great job here. And if I am correct about what lies behind that email server, we're going to see a major deep state push. They're going to try and find some way to stop this, to keep it from happening. And it may even involve wet work, as was the case with Seth Rich. So, Tom Fitton, I hope you're wearing your Kevlar undies. And again, she was using this private email system. She had been told this was not allowed. Now, Hillary tried to come on out and say, well, I had no idea. I didn't know. When you are given a security clearance, you get a sit-down meeting and you are told all the rules about the proper handling of classified information. And having a private email server in your home on which some of that information is kept is not part of the deal. And there's still that question about what was on the missing 33,000 mails, the mails that she deleted, which the National Security Agency says they have. And they offered them to James Comey, and he said, no, I do not want to see those. So this goes back to my pet theory. Back in 2016, was Hillary Clinton repeating the Chinagate scandal and selling U.S. secrets to foreign interests using that weak email server to deliver the goods and that so-called charitable foundation to collect and launder the payments. That's where she got a lot of the money for her campaign. This is a question somebody's got to ask. It's a question that deserves an answer. You, the American people, have a right to know if this kind of skullduggery is going on at the highest levels of our government. So, we're coming up here on the end of the program, and stay tuned for John Stadmiller. I'm sure he's got lots of interesting things to share with you. Please take what you learn here, share them with everybody that you know. Private email, face-to-face, bring back the art of the conversation. Right now, the corporate social media is just clamping down on the filters to try and keep more American people from waking up. But remember that story in the middle of today's show. Half of American high schoolers do not trust the corporate media. We are winning this, people. We just keep going the way we are. We will get there. Please donate to Republic Broadcasting. Have a good evening. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.